history of the world than his religious policies. Because had he blown it in the dark days after Adrianople, there might not have been an empire left to Christianize. That said, allowing the undefeated Goths to settle in Roman territory and essentially live under their own laws would have profound negative consequences down the road. It is, after all, another one of the 257 different reasons why the Western Empire fell apart. But we'll get into all that a bit down the road. For now, though, we must turn to Theodosius' more immediate legacy. Namely, that his untimely death meant that control of the empire fell into the hands of a 16-year-old and an 11-year-old, neither of whom were well trained in the military arts, had any real experience with statecraft, or, if you believe the pronouncements of most modern scholars, were particularly bright individuals. Sadly for the good people of the Roman Empire, their emperors Arcadius and Honorius turned out to be a couple of underage, dim bulbs, who were so easily manipulated and pushed around that their reigns were defined most especially by the revolving door of ambitious advisors who were constantly cutting each other's throats in order to take their turn being the real power behind the throne. Without anything resembling a firm hand on the tiller, power-hungry ministers and generals began to run amok, fatally undermining the political solidarity that the empire so desperately needed at the dawn of the 5th century. The first two of those power-hungry ministers stepped to the plate upon the death of Theodosius in January 395, and of course, since political solidarity was so vitally important at the dawn of the 5th century, it was perfect that they were personal enemies, who were more than willing to extend their rivalries into official state policy. Awesome. The first of these ministers was Stilicho, the Vandal general who had risen to become Theodosius' son-in-law and the leader of the Eastern Army. The other was the Praetorian prefect Rufinus, who had been left in charge of Constantinople when that Eastern army had marched west. Arcadius and Honorius had both been left in Rufinus' care when their father had marched off to face down Eugenius and Arbogast, but when Theodosius became deathly ill, Honorius was called to Milan in case he needed to assume the mantle of Western Augustus. Aware that his time was drawing near, Theodosius began scrambling to get some sort of succession plan in place, and he naturally turned to Stilicho to ensure that things wouldn't go to hell the minute he died. Or did die, that Stilicho would act as a de facto regent for the underage Honorius. Given the general's familial connection to Theodosius, this came as a surprise to no one. But then came the curveball. Just before he died, Theodosius dismissed all his other ministers so he could have a private chat with Stilicho. During this chat, Theodosius told his son-in-law that he wanted Stilicho to act as a guardian not just of Honorius, but of Arcadius as well. This deathbed request effectively became the emperor's last words, as he died almost immediately after this secret conversation. But you can probably see the problem here. Stilicho was the only one present for this momentous pronouncement. Everyone assumed the Vandal general was going to rule the West, and everyone was fine with that. But now suddenly, he was wandering around telling people that Theodosius secretly told him at the last minute that he was supposed to rule the East too. To which I would have reacted, you don't actually expect me to believe that obvious load of complete BS, do you? But Stilicho apparently did expect everyone to believe it, and for almost the entire time he was in power, he maintained his rather bizarre claim to regency over the whole empire. To top it all off, modern historians are not even convinced that there ever was a secret conversation, that the whole thing had been made up out of whole cloth after the fact to explain Stilicho's attempt to seize control of the Eastern Empire. Probably the person laughing hardest at Stilicho's obvious load of complete BS was back in Constantinople, the Praetorian prefect Rufinus. As I mentioned, he and Stilicho were bitter enemies, so you can probably imagine his reaction when a messenger arrived one day bearing the news that Stilicho was claiming Theodosius secretly wanted him to control the Eastern Empire. I picture Rufinus falling out of his chair laughing, picking himself up off the floor, and then immediately making plans to kill Stilicho at the earliest opportunity. But Stilicho would prove himself to be an extremely savvy operator, far savvier than Rufinus anyway, who will, incidentally, wind up dead in a ditch in less than a year. Eager to solidify his position as the new de facto regent, and I say de facto because there was no official regent position in Roman law, he turned to the most powerful man in the Western Empire, Ambrose of Milan, for support. The Vandal general and the Roman bishop forged an alliance that was sealed when Ambrose publicly endorsed the claim that Stilicho had been ordered to preside over both imperial brothers, rather than just Honorius. But Rufinus was undeterred. Stilicho could make all the laughable claims he wanted. There was no way the Praetorian prefect was giving an inch of political space. This test of wills came to a head in 395, in an incident that put on full display the consequences of personal rivalry spilling over into official policy. As I've mentioned, the Goths were not at all happy about the way they had been used at the Battle of the Frigidus, and it was an article of faith among them that they had been intentionally led to the slaughter to weaken their power. Initially, Alaric, the leading chief of the Gothic army, neither stoked these fires nor did anything really to dampen them out. He was more reserved than his countrymen because, with all the reshuffling that was underway following the death of Theodosius, he thought he saw an opportunity to follow in the footsteps of Ricimer and Arbogast and Stilicho and become a barbarian general in the Roman army. But Stilicho in particular was hugely opposed to the idea of Alaric serving Rome in an official capacity, mostly because combining the role of Gothic king with Roman general was a frightening prospect. Alaric led his troops back to Thrace in the spring of 395, but when he got there, he received word that he was not, in fact, going to be offered a command, and so, feeling betrayed, he started actively encouraging the Goths' hostility. In just a few weeks, their rage boiled over, and the Central Empire was once again dealing with a marauding Gothic army. Since the Romans had just fought a big old civil war in northern Italy, that's where most of the troops of the Empire were at the moment, and so it fell to Stilicho to deal with Alaric's rampaging Goths. But the army Stilicho led through the Alps was not really in tip-top shape, nor a particularly cohesive unit. The damage done at the Frigidus was still being felt, not just in terms of physical fighting ability, but also in terms of the troops actually trusting each other. After all, the men who made up Stilicho's army had just been hacking each other to pieces the previous autumn. It was a little difficult for them to grasp that they were all now on the same side. But there was no getting around the fact that the Goths needed to be settled, so off Stilicho went to try to settle them. The Vandal was a deft general, and knowing the weakness of his own army, decided to engage in a positional campaign designed to hem Alaric in, rather than trying to break him in a set-piece battle. Eventually, Stilicho's strategy proved so successful that the Goths became trapped in a terrible position. If Stilicho was ever going to take a shot at battle, now would be the time to do it. But then a surprise order came in from Arcadius, originating of course with Rufinus, demanding that Stilicho return the eastern troops to Constantinople and withdraw from Greece at once. That Stilicho decided to comply with this order hints that he maybe had no intention of actually attacking the Goths, but he sure told everyone who would listen that he had been fatally undercut by that sneaky snake Rufinus, who had robbed the Romans of a certain victory simply to deny me, noble Stilicho, a personal victory. Whoever's idea it was to let Alaric go, and there is good evidence that it was indeed Stilicho's idea, the fact that the Gothic chief lived to fight another day wound up having some pretty serious consequences down the road. Next week, we will begin to feel some of those consequences, as the empire will break down into three political centers of gravity: Stilicho in the west, Alaric in the center, and whoever happens. Over the next few years, they will all play everyone off everyone else in a tricky and often bloody game of political chess that will wind up leaving the empire with very few pieces left on the board. This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. As you know, Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment with over 100,000 titles to choose from. When you're done with this episode, go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome. That again, audiblepodcast.com/Rome. By going to that address, you qualify for a free book download when you sign up for a 14-day trial membership. There is no obligation to continue the service, and you can cancel anytime and keep the free book. Or you can keep going with one of the monthly subscription options and get great deals on all future audiobook purchases. This week, I am going to go with a recommendation from listener Larry L., The 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene, which appears to be a fun list of maxims designed to help you win and maintain power. Things like do not commit to anyone and crush your enemies totally. Illustrated by historical examples, it looks like exactly the sort of book that would have amused Julius Caesar. Just remember to go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome so that they know who sent you. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 160, East versus West. In the summer of 395, Stilicho led practically the only Roman army of consequence left in the empire into Thrace to face down Alaric and his rampaging Goths. But right at the moment when it appeared that victory was within his grasp, Stilicho suddenly decided to detach the eastern contingent of his army and return it to Constantinople before leading the rest of his army back towards the west. Preparing to make his last stand, Alaric wound up simply watching the Roman army dissipate without so much as a sword being drawn. Scholars long blamed the machinations of the eastern Praetorian prefect Rufinus for the order to break up Stilicho's army, but it is just as likely that Stilicho himself never had any intention of bringing Alaric to battle, and was just happy for any excuse to withdraw. As later events would show, as much as imperial propaganda liked to paint the Goths as out-of-control monsters, the courts of both East and West knew that they were actually an incredibly valuable military resource to be utilized, not some terrible foreign enemy to be defeated at all costs. Put simply, crushing the Goths would have meant crippling the long-term war-making power of the empire. And beyond that, the courts of East and West also understood that crushing the Goths would have meant losing a potential ace in the hole to be laid down in the high-stakes game of political poker they were playing with each other. Aside from long-term geopolitical strategy, Stilicho had another incentive for breaking up his army. Whether he was the instigator of the coming assassination of Rufinus, or just an interested third party, is unknown, but it is hard to believe Stilicho didn't know what was going to happen when the eastern troops returned to Constantinople. Heading back east under the command of an ethnically Goth general named Gainas, the troops arrived at the great capital city in the late summer of 395. The Emperor Arcadius came out to the army's camp to greet them, and the prefect Rufinus was by his side. But when they arrived, a hand-picked company of soldiers surrounded the shocked prefect and unceremoniously hacked him to death. Rufinus,